Dr. Chandra, thank you
Yeah.
for joining us. We really appreciate your time. This is our first just conversation in a series of many others to come. As we know, there is a lot going on in the world today, starting with the Ukraine war, Taiwan conflict, the earthquake we had in Turkey, also one of the tragic highlights of this week that has shocked all of us, and we are still actually affected and hurt by it, and there is still excavation efforts going on. So with this in mind, we really appreciate your time. We would like to take a few minutes to discuss with you and talk with you and reflect about what opportunities and what threats are actually hanging over the community, humanity, for us. In this short conversation, perhaps we should revolve around the call campaign, which was launched last fall in joint collaboration with Professor Joseph Camilleri and Professor Richard Falk. So that was a timely step taken, but we've seen that not much has changed since, and yet much of your outlined steps there actually have been reversed, and a lot of things have gone on the wrong direction, on the opposite direction that was advised. So would you like to say a few words since the call campaign? What kind of highlights, events, what kind of things we take stock of?
Thank you, Elma. Let me begin by congratulating you on this initiative. Glad that you thought that this idea of conversations, the plural, various individuals taking part in conversations, would be good for just and good for all of us. In that spirit, I was happy to respond positively, to agree to participate in this. And since it was suggested that we should begin with the call campaign, well, basically the Ukraine crisis and what it means for global politics and global security, I thought it's something that a lot of people would be able to empathize with. They'd be able to understand what is going on and what issues are being raised and so on. So let's begin with the call campaign. This is, as you said a while ago, Elma, an initiative linked to three of us, Professor Richard Falk, Professor Joseph Camilleri, and myself, very old friends, all linked in one way or another to international relations, international politics. And we felt when we started talking to each other about what is happening in Ukraine, that it would be good to initiate a campaign of sorts. And the campaign could take various stages. We were not expecting to see an immediate response from the stakeholders. We knew that it's a campaign that would face a lot of obstacles, so we're not surprised that the campaign has not achieved anything tangible so far. That's the fact.
Yet we've seen quite a number of relevant and important people sign off the campaign, and I've seen and I've heard also discussions around it.
Yeah, it's true. The response from others in the field of international relations and activists, public intellectuals has been really very gratifying. Initially, we had 44 respondents with various backgrounds, names such as Mary Maguire, the Peace Laureate, who is a member of the Just International Advisory Panel, and others like Chomsky, who is also a member of the Just International Advisory Panel. And we also had people like
Varoufakis, I guess, one of those that signed up. Yanis Varoufakis.
From Greece, the former minister. Yeah, he was one of those who signed up. You're right. And people like Chris Hedges, and a number of other commentators and writers and so on. You can see it if you go to change.org or you visit the Just website or some of the other websites linked to people like Richard Falk and Joseph Camilleri. Now, we were quite convinced that a campaign like this would require greater effort, that you will not see immediate results, but we would continue our struggle. We've had one webinar on the 27th of October, 2022 last year, which was quite successful.
There is another coming up, I guess. I've seen
That's
that.
right, correct. Another one that's coming up on the 23rd of February. And this next webinar would be more focused on global security, Ukraine and global security, rethinking global security. And we hope to take these discussions forward that way. Now, let me just highlight two aspects of this ongoing campaign, Elma. Number one, we felt, and I think that feeling has become even more acute in the last few weeks. We felt that if we didn't do anything, if others didn't do anything, if the world just kept quiet and watched what was happening, we would in no time enter a very dangerous zone, which is what is happening now.
Which is what is happening right now.
That's right. We've come very close to the threat of nuclear holocaust. As you know, the group of atomic scientists who come up with a bulletin on Doomsday, they moved the clock to just 9 seconds away from a nuclear holocaust, And that's what people should be very concerned about. We're not saying that this is going to happen, but if you look at all the signs are...
Is there any sense of powerlessness in the civil society, in the people, as individuals, as individual figures, no matter what kind is their involvement or position in the society? Do you think there is this sense of powerlessness that no matter what they think, what opinion they have, or what they do, no matter how they engage, they are not gonna effect, or they are not gonna tilt this flow of events in any way? Because as we speak, there is a global peace forum going on in Malaysia right now. I'm not sure is it held in Malaysia, but a few years ago it was held in Kuala Lumpur. 7 to 10 February, Global Peace Forum, but nobody is expecting them to have any effect, or nobody is expecting the events to be impacted in any way. So do you think there is this sense of powerlessness in the individual actors?
That's part of it. You're right, Elma, that people feel hopeless, that they can't do very much about the situation. They're not able to persuade those who are right at the vortex to sit back and think about what is happening, to sort of retrace their steps to prevent escalation on both sides, threats that we see from Vladimir Putin. The other side, you have NATO, United States, and others overwhelming Ukraine with weapons, as if this is the solution. You're not really thinking about what all this is going to lead to. And
the Donetsk and Donbass separatists, they've been armed by Russia long ago. I guess it's been going on since 2014. So this arms race now it's just being intensified in a way. So I think there is alarming voices pointing out to this.
Yeah, and it's more than Ukraine, as I'm sure you know, and as someone following this conflict, that Ukraine, in a sense, is a pawn in this larger game. It's just a pawn. It's being used,
and tragically so.
Yeah,
it's the
and
people that are paying the price.
That's right, and they're paying the price. Thousands and thousands have died. We don't have any accurate figures as such, but we know both civilians and soldiers have paid the price. And of course, on the side of Russia, it's soldiers, but nonetheless, it's all human lives that we're talking about, that have been lost, families that are grieving, and so on. And the devastation in terms of physical infrastructure, the devastation in terms of the impact upon the environment, and of course, the way in which other concerns that should be right at the forefront have been pushed into the background because of Ukraine and this conflict, whether it is climate change or the tragedy of Palestine, or what's happening in Pakistan, or the hunger and starvation in East Africa. Somehow these things are no longer at the
primary focus.
And of
we've
course,
seen also the military budgets being revised across a whole array of countries, and everybody's like,
and in a way,
it's a very dangerous direction. It's a wave of frenzy, military arms race, and that's not been predicted to be happening a few years ago.
And that also means that resources are being directed in favor of the military and in favor of, conflicts, if you like. And we're not giving enough attention to other things that are equally urgent, far more urgent perhaps, in terms of rebuilding our cities, in terms of providing employment, and taking economic measures which will help the poor and marginalized in our societies, looking at our education systems, improving them, healthcare. All these things are being ignored, as we are caught in this frenzy of fighting an unnecessary war. Actually, in many ways, it is an unnecessary war.
Every war is unnecessary. Every war is unnecessary.
Yeah, true, very true, And more so, if you look at this particular war, it could have been avoided, and this is where I think we have to get into some of the underlying forces. If for the last 30, 40 years, the centers of power in the West had responded to some of the fears that Russia had expressed about the global situation and about the expansion of NATO. You see, this is something which a lot of people have not focused upon, unfortunately, Elma, but we have tried to focus upon this particular issue, that if you look at the expansion of NATO and what the hopes which were generated immediately after the end of the Cold War, the so-called Cold War, the way in which Gorbachev, at that time, the Russian leader, said that if the West would agree not to expand eastwards and create fears amongst Russia. Don't forget that this is nothing unusual. If you look at the Cuban crisis, you will know what this means. 1962, the Americans reacted almost immediately to the emplacement of Russian missiles in Cuba. And that was, as you know, a response to an invasion that took place. And the invasion was the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, which failed. And Cuba reacted, very small little island, just 90 kilometers from the American coast. They wanted some protection. And Russia, being a very close ally, well, Soviet Union rather, close ally of Cuba, they responded. And then, of course, there was this huge crisis, and we would have had a war.
Yes, Dr. Chandra, we also should notice that the context, the international context, was slightly different then, and it's slightly different now. I've read this kind of analysis, and they point out, and like you said, this could have easily been avoided. Not perhaps easily, but with some effort, it could have been avoided. The international context keep changing, and we cannot translate or convert what happened a few decades ago to today, because the constellation is slightly different today.
It is, Elma, but on the other hand, there's some underlying principles that don't change. And I think one of the principles is this, that you should have empathy for the other side. Absolutely. Not only in human relations, but also in interstate relations. If you feel that so-and-so is a threat to you because of whatever danger you sense, if the other person responds in a certain way, it's also because that person is concerned, and you should also respond accordingly. But that has not happened. And that I think is very unfortunate, because if you go back to 1992 and the end of the Cold War, and the statements made by Gorbachev on the one hand, people like Chris Baker and Ronald Reagan and others, you get the impression that the West saw the end of the Cold War as an opportunity to expand their power. And I'm not saying that the entire Russian leadership saw it differently. Certainly Gorbachev did. Gorbachev was in that sense quite different, from the others. And he felt that this was a chance to seek peace in the real sense of the word. And he felt let down, but there was nothing he could do about it. And it had continued. You remember that the invitation to Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO had gone out a long time ago. It's not recent. And of course, Georgia was subjected to an attack by Russia. And that was because of the moves which had been made on the other side. So this is
absolutely. Very recently, I saw a movie actually about the Azerbaijan independence, and how they declared the independence in the very early days, and then how Lenin said that the revolution cannot survive without Baku oil. And then, of course, in a matter of months, they attacked Azerbaijan, and they took the country over for another next 70 years. So I think there is a certain dynamics that's been happening there for the past century, and it's always these geopolitical powers that seem to forget that there is also citizens, and there is people living in these countries, that they could also have some kind of opinion about how to proceed with their own national agenda.
Yeah. Well, it's perhaps linked to a larger question. I don't think we can have a secure and safe international environment unless, number one, we recognize the independence and sovereignty of individual states. That's very important, however small they may be. I think your example of Azerbaijan is a good example, and that would go for other things that had happened in the course of the expansion of both the Soviet empire, if you like, which eventually became the USSR. And if you look at what had happened in the case of the expansion of the United States of America, the way in which it annexed states, right? It was a very sort of a process, a historical process that ignored the feelings of ordinary people and the rights of small nation states, small entities, and so on. And that has been a problem. So I see that as the first principle that one is to uphold, the rights of individual states, sovereignty, independence. And number two, I think one should adopt this principle in human relations, interpersonal relations, but also in the relations between states, that you should not do something which you would not want the other person to do to you. In other words, there's a quid pro quo that we must always observe. What you don't want done to you, don't do to other people.
Rather, they are most of the time operating through preemptive kind of logic. So everything is being justified through preemptive logic. Yes, so Russia, for example, invaded Ukraine through some kind of preemptive logic that Ukraine is going to be, used against their security threat in the future. And China is also doing the same for Taiwan. And in your call campaign, you mentioned something about one China principle. And I would like if you can, elaborate a little bit, what's the difference between one China principle and one China policy? Because it seems there is a slight difference, and there is some kind of actually very critical and crucial difference in these two. It's a play with words, but at the same time, it has some, policy ramifications.
I don't think we used it in that sense, no, Elma. I think we were referring to the principle that is derived from recognition of the fact that there is only one China. A principle derived from a reality. And the reality is there is no one China, and Taiwan is part of China. Taiwan has always been part of China, and the fact that the Chiang Kai-shek regime, after its defeat, moved over to this island, and
exactly, yeah.
The fact that the government in Beijing did not
accept that, yeah.
The island is largely because I think China was not inclined to do it, and it was in no position to do that sort of thing. But it does in no way does it justify what has been happening in the name of Taiwan and its assertion of its right and all the rest of it. I find it very, very odd that this has reached this particular level. And I think one of the reasons why it has reached this level is because America is heavily invested in Taiwan.
Oh, definitely. There is
both economic
and technological reasons behind it too. But if we go back to history and to the political background, Taiwan government, ideologically speaking, is not on the same terms with the China government. So if I am correct, they were anti-communist. So when the communism wave took over the whole China, there is a group of people who opposed it. It was also in any communist country. In my hometown, we also had always people who fought against the communist takeover. So I guess that the Taiwanese representatives were that kind of strain, ideologically speaking, standing the ground and, opposing the, monolithic ideology in that sense. So I guess if we talk about the independence of the individual states, it's not supposed to be only on ethnic basis, or it's not supposed to be only on cultural basis. In that sense, it's also ideological basis. If I mean, individuals who do not want to be communists, they should be allowed to choose so.
Well, you're right when you say that communism is a totalistic philosophy. It's totalistic, and because it's totalistic and it has this notion of a larger goal that is all encompassing, it will not allow for that sort of initiative, something which goes against that type of philosophy. And I'm not justifying it, but I'm saying that this is what communism is. Communism is like that. But in terms of territorial integrity, which is a different issue, Beijing was right in arguing that Taiwan is part of China, and they fled. They were defeated in 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and his followers, and they fled to this island of Taiwan. where there were already people, there was a government, there was an administration, and they allowed the administration to accommodate these people. In other words, they did not say, well, kill them all or wipe them out. There was a certain understanding that they would be allowed to live there. And there were other relationships and connections between some of the communist leaders and the leaders of the Kuomintang. It was known as the Kuomintang. Yeah, this is the Chiang Kai-shek regime. But after a few years, it became a movement that developed strength of its own. And finally, as a result of the electoral process and so on, they managed to come to power in Taiwan. And I think it is since then that they've been asserting their rights in a certain manner. But even today, Taiwan is very divided. There are people who are very pro-integration with China. They're very strong. And they'd won certain elections and so on. And then you've got people who are against integration with China, who don't want to be integrated, like the president of Taiwan and so on. She's very much opposed to this. So I think it is, in that sense, a very complex situation, but nonetheless, you have to go by certain rules as far as international relations go. And for me, I think territorial integrity is one of the rules that one has.
So my point is that, of course, we cannot direct what is going to happen in real situation. And obviously there is this sentiment that China is overpowering the region and they have rights for everything. But I'm saying, like, theoretically speaking, these international kind of rules, they should evolve. And that they should allow for pockets of citizenship representations to survive and to cooperate, even if it's like we had Taiwan, and I understand that maybe Taiwan is also implicated in neo-imperialistic kind of history. But my point is that the international rules should take into account that the citizenship consciousness is not the same as what it was like 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Nowadays, there could be one full city and then they could will for certain kind of government, for certain kind of ideology. And as long as they are peaceful, they should be allowed to self-administer. It doesn't have to be under one superpower under another superpower. That's what I'm saying, because all of the time when we read this analysis, being produced every day, it's always geopolitical kind of logic. This is Russia's territory, this is China's territory, this is US influenced territory. I think we should be transcending this kind of logic, and we should be accommodating a different kind of human consciousness in our day and age. What do you think?
See, Elma, I sort of beg to differ. I think that sort of argument doesn't take into account prevailing realities. What do I mean by this? Yes,
but we cannot change realities unless we start thinking differently.
Yeah, but what has happened is the situation has become much worse at the international level because we have allowed the logic of power to dominate everything. If you sort of looked at the logic of your argument, what it means is let countries be what they are, and people be allowed to choose what they want to do and all the rest of it, as if these things exist in a vacuum. They don't, Elma. Very often you don't have any choice. What we have seen happening is, this is what I meant by the realities of the situation. You have individual nation states, there are 193 of them, right? They're small states, middling states, big states. Yeah. But if you look at what has happened in the last so many decades, it is one powerful nation state that has been able to impose its will politically over the rest. And that's the United States of America, because it has got military power behind it. And this is the reality. And this is why you have a certain global economy. The global economy is not based upon economic realities that you and I understand. It is based upon basically the power of the dollar. And the power of the dollar,
I think that's another area whereby the citizenship freedom is actually very questionable, because you might be having some kind of lip service political rights, but economically speaking, we are like really in a very bad situation right now, and it's going to get worse with this kind of international system.
Yeah, true. And so this is what I meant by the reality. So if you look at what's really happening, it's a powerful nation state which has interpreted global security, global politics, global economy, the global culture, everything in terms of its own image. And it has succeeded to a great extent. And when it's challenged, it is the challenge that leads to instability. It leads to instability only because the dominant power wants everything to be framed and shaped in its own image. And this is something which I think people will not accept. What were the two forces that stood up against Western dominance of this sort at the end of the Cold War, at the end of the Second World War? If you look at the end of the Second World War, the US was the only nation that emerged completely unscathed from the war. Even the victors, the other victors like Britain and France and others, they were very badly scarred, by the war. But the United States was different. So what the US did was it used its dominant power at that stage, and it's a power that expressed itself in all sorts of dimensions. They used that power to try to develop a world order which would be totally in its own favor. And at that time, the USSR was on its side, China was on its side, they were all on their side. And then what happened within a few years is China, 1949 revolution, became different, did not want to follow the Pied Piper, did not want to follow the US. In the case of the USSR, again, it decided, again, it was 1949, the Iron Curtain and all the rest of it, that it would not want to follow the US. And as a result of that, you had different forces emerging. And then, of course, a number of states became independent. And independent nation states, they did not want to follow either the USSR or US. And this is how the non-aligned movement came into being. So I feel that these were developments which were in some ways healthy, because you had many states coming up, asserting themselves and all the rest of it. And then you have the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, and then this attempt yet again, after so many years, 1991, 1992, to dominate everyone once again. And then you have this reaction. And the invention of the Islamic terrorist is this part of that game. You'll find that after that, it was China on the one hand and Islam on the other, that these were the new threats. And that became dominant. That became the rhetoric for the next few decades. And we are still in it. We're still in that sort of, framework. And I think that this is something that we have to recognize, that this tendency to hegemonize, to want to establish hegemonic power, and actually it is not in line with what you are suggesting, Elma, because what you're suggesting, a world where people respect one another. And I don't think that is the world.
We are allowed to dream. We are allowed to dream of a world whereby people respect one another, in a world whereby we have a different international system that respects individual states' rights to exist in their own terms, and respects the individual citizenship willpower for self-determination. We are allowed to dream. And I'm not assuming that all of this is existing in vacuum. I would never assume that. But we are allowed to dream about it, and we are allowed to work about it. And like I said, if we don't think differently about the reality, then we will never change it.
Yeah, but my point is that in order to achieve that reality, which is not just a dream, if you look at the UN General Assembly, the General Assembly is based on that principle. Individual nation states, their rights, their sovereignty, right? But why is it that the individual nation states, whatever their will may be, their collective will, they're not able to prevail? For instance, the individual nation states were against the war in Iraq.
It's the veto system, right? The veto system is still in power.
The veto system is just one manifestation of it. But apart from that, it is the dominant power of one particular nation state. And that power is overwhelming.
You may not say it's only one hegemony. There is also other hegemonies. For example, Russia and China, they both block our independence. They've been blocking Kosovo independence, and now in the past few weeks, we are now on the verge of another war, which might be regional conflict. So if you think about it, the other hegemonies also are not thinking in peace terms so much. It's all about expansion, and you've seen Russia and China, they both have been expanding economically exactly in this international system that we are criticizing. So as long as they took out of it, they used it. So we've seen, everybody says it's a miracle how China has economically expanded in the past 50 years. It's a complete economic miracle. And it happened exactly not in a vacuum, but in this international system that we are, criticizing.
Yeah, but just because it has happened, it doesn't mean that there isn't a hegemon around. You've got a hegemon. You find very hard to dominate and to control. But in spite of that, some of the tools that are available to the hegemon, they're not working. That's the reason why things like this happen. For instance, if you look at the global monetary system, it's because the US dollar is in a mess. The US dollar is in a mess, partly because the US domestic economy is in total mess. You have a dollar currency which dominates the world, but which doesn't have the wherewithal to play that role. Why doesn't it have the wherewithal to play that role? For the simple reason that you look at the situation today in terms of resources, in terms of investments, in terms of trade, the United States is not at the forefront. And you can't blame anyone for this. It's because others have decided to develop their economies. And the United States is not happy with it. They would like to stop.
I think we can blame corporations. Actually, there is actors to be blamed, and we can really identify them. It's
yeah, but nonetheless, you find that the rise of China that you and I acknowledge is a reality. The rise of China is largely because the Chinese produce cheaper, more affordable goods that the world consumes. They penetrate markets all over the world, and not because others are more than willing to bring in the Chinese. It's simply because Chinese goods are cheaper and they're good, And so at the same time, you find the Chinese invest everywhere, not because, again, other investors are pushed aside. No, the reality is because the Chinese investors are able to help some of the domestic partners to develop at the same time. The one belt, one road policy, for instance, for all its weaknesses, it is actually a far more enlightened policy than what the United States has been able to offer the world. For the United States, its bases, its military pacts, its dominance, its control. But here you have the Chinese coming along and saying, look, we try to develop these economies together. And in many instances, it has helped to some extent to do what, like in Africa, the reason why, if you look at every survey done in Africa, the vast majority of Africans, and not just corporate people, these are ordinary Africans, they prefer the Chinese to the Americans. And the reason is because, you find that when the Chinese go in there, they build railway lines, they build roads, they build, houses, they do all these things. And at the same time, you find that the Chinese are able to, the indigenous people are able to develop.
Yeah,
so I think there is a difference.
I am always an advocate of people's sentiment. So if in like the Belt Road, the One Belt policy, it has a long history to it. It's not a new invention. It has existed before the Silk Road. So if we talk about people's sentiments, it's understandable that there will be some connection between the local people and the opportunities arising. But at the same time, the people's sentiment in Europe, I mean, historically speaking, it's been anti-Russian. So we cannot, this is a missing element that I've seen also in some of the analysis, circulating, that they miss this point that Swedish people, Finnish people, Ukrainians, they have a very bitter history with Russia, and they would rather tilt towards having some kind of security offered by NATO or by, European Union, rather than imagine a future tied up back to Russia. So this is an element that has been missing in some of the analysis that's been circulating. Because again, like I said, it's all in geopolitical terms, but the people have a collective memory and they don't have good things to remember about what Russia did in the region, in the past few decades.
That's a good point, Elma. I think it is something that should be acknowledged. The Russia, meaning by which the USSR that emerged and its relations with some of the other states and how it came into being and so on. And also, I suppose, if you look at 1956, Czechoslovakia, if you look at, what happened in the case of Romania, Poland, and, so on, yes, we can understand why countries in Eastern Europe have had a certain relationship, they react in a certain manner, and it is something that one has to take into account. But don't forget, Elma, at the same time, that a lot of perceptions are shaped by certain other forces which don't want to tell the whole story. Let me give one small example. Very recently, 2nd of February, as you know, was the day that Stalingrad was emancipated, right, during the Second World War.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an important date. People forget.
I think there was a commemoration very recently whereby Putin raised up a statue of Stalin, which for me was like completely absurd.
But see again, Elma, like you, I too was, brought up on this diet of, what Stalin did, terrible things and so on, which is true, right? The kulaks and all the rest of it. But don't forget
the Holodomor in Ukraine.
But don't forget Stalin's role in the defense against Nazism. It is just amazing. Don't forget that Russia sacrificed, how many million people, the deaths of the Russians, they're the ones who paid in terms of blood for the survival of a system.
Actually, I would beg to disagree.
No. I think, Elma, let me just finish that point. I think it's a very important point, that more than any other nation in the world, including all the Western nations, and sold propaganda about the West and about Winston Churchill and so on. Look at the sacrifice on the other side of the others. 20 million Russians died in the fight against Nazism. And it was amazing. And if you look at the Stalingrad, battle, I'd been reading some things about it. It was just amazing how they defended what they felt was the integrity of a system of their own nation, of course, their own people, against the Nazis. And that is a major contribution. I don't think Nazism could ever have been defeated without the role of the Soviet Union.
Geopolitically speaking, absolutely agreed. But at a more granular level, it was the local people who actually fought the war, because my country and the whole region here was like directly involved against Nazi fascist forces. And later on, unfortunately, they also converted to communism. But it was the local people who stood up the ground. The war was not fought by the communists in that sense. They came quite late in truth. And at another level, globally speaking, the Indians fought the war against Nazis for the British Empire. It was like millions of Indians who actually sacrificed their lives to fight against Nazism. So I understand that there is realities that maybe we don't see it like being spoken of, but it's not Russians who should be credited. It is the local people. And my grandfather, for example, he was one of the fighters against Nazism, and we like I said, the collective memory is very much alive. It's not too far away, Dr. Chandra, and people remember things.
Yeah, but I'm saying that if one wants to be fair, one has to acknowledge what happened, which was real, which was in the interest of humanity, and also what was bad. I mean, it's just like we say, look, the USSR had no business invading countries like Romania or Czechoslovakia or Poland, that this was not right. Likewise, we say that what Nazi Germany did was wrong, and Russia put up a fantastic defense, and it was huge sacrifice. You know?
They never left. The problem with Russian is that they came, they fought against Nazism, and then they stayed for decades. They never left. And the local people would have wanted them to leave, you know?
Yeah,
But yeah, it's like I said, it was a different time, different constellation of geopolitics in those days. But ideally speaking, you know, NGOs, civil society, individuals, ideally speaking, they should have a stronger voice in these matters.
Yeah, sure. You know, and we hope that NGOs and civil society, you know, and I agree with you, should be able to provide a more sane, balanced, and rational
international institutions, hopefully, to be
yes,
strengthened in the
position
future,
on issues
as
of
per your
reform. You know, yeah,
whole campaign.
yeah. But you see,
Unfortunately,
unfortunately, you know, you find that a lot of the discourse, even by NGOs, one has to be honest about this, is shaped by the media, and the media is dominated by certain forces. And whether we like it or not, you'll find that the media means that there are certain interests, and they push this interest. Look at the reporting in the Western media as a whole, and we pay some attention to this. You know, the Western media's reports on Ukraine. Yeah, a lot of it is distorted. Yeah, I'm not saying that the Russian media doesn't do the same. They do the same, but within their own confines. It doesn't have the impact of the Western media. The Russian media doesn't have the impact of AP, UPI, you know, of various other channels, your CNN and BBC and all the rest of it. The BBC has the reach that no Russian media channel has, you know.
absolutely, media is a strong factor, but even media can distort facts only up to a certain degree. Like right now, it's not Ukraine invading Russia; it's Russia invading Ukraine. So media can you know conflate facts and misinterpret things and all that, but only to a certain degree.
Yeah, but I think there's some consensus even in this, Elma. I think most of us would agree that the Russian invasion, 24th February of Ukraine was wrong, ethically wrong, legally wrong, indefensible, right? But we cannot run away from the fact that there is a whole history behind this. And it's not just a history which we alluded to just now, you know, Cold War, what happened after the Cold War and all the rest of it. It's also a history that is even more recent. If you look at what happened in 2014, a democratically elected leader was overthrown. He was overthrown basically through a CIA plot, right? Whatever one may say about that leader, I mean, he was trying to do what he thought was best for Ukraine, but he was an elected leader. He was overthrown, right? And they put up a puppet regime. And that's part of the problems. And if you look at what has happened in Donbass and what had happened in Luhansk and Donetsk and so on, which is part of the whole Donbass region, I think it is really tragic, the number of people who were killed. And who are those who were killed? The majority of those who were killed.
Yeah, it's been going for years. It's really tragic. And I guess everybody was ignoring it for so long. And
That's
even
right.
the Crimean annexation, everybody was trying to, put the fire down and, try to minimize the effect. But about the puppet regime, I understand that there was some dynamics going on in there, but I think also the argument can be questioned, because if the problem was just the puppet regime, the Ukrainian people today wouldn't be fighting Russian forces, because they would be siding with Russian forces, and that's not what is happening. So again, it goes back. Maybe this argument maybe was like appealing to many of us 1 year ago, or maybe slightly more than that. But today we see a different picture, and it's again, to me, it's the people who account for the biggest evidence. And the Ukrainian people right now are not saying stop the war, we want to go back to Russia. We haven't heard that, and it's not a matter.
I think the dichotomies are still what they were before to a great extent. In other words, the Russian-speaking people of the Donbass region, right, and Russian-speaking people in other regions, the east and in the south and so on, those Russian-speaking people, they are still with Russia. That hasn't changed.
Yeah, but the puppet government was not
which
only.
which I think goes to show that that very important reality of Ukrainian society has been ignored by the government and by the Western forces.
Dr. Chandra, we have also our north conflict, north border conflict here, and there is a lot of parallels with what's happening there and what's happening here. It's really very intriguing plots always being brought up by Serbia in our case, for example. And you know, it's really something that it's so close to home, you know, that it's really tragic in many ways, whereby people are more interested to you know, stoke fire rather than come to some kind of peaceful existential agreement. And it would benefit everybody to spend the money we are spending in economic revival rather than in arms race, indeed.
Yeah, of course, yes. Yeah, and this is why, you know, I would say once again that, you know, the invasion of Ukraine was foolish in terms of what it has led to. And one of them is, of course, the arms race, yeah. And that is something that we should have avoided at all costs. I think the question that perhaps Putin was concerned about, and others, many others, not just Putin, they were concerned about was NATO expansion and basically US-led hegemony. But US-led hegemony cannot be overcome through a war. This is why it's so foolish. You cannot overcome this through a war. You have to overcome US hegemony through various other dimensions, including global consciousness raising, developing alternative institutions. Look at what's happened through the United Nations General Assembly. The US does not control the UN General Assembly. Why? Because individual nation states stand up, whether it is on the question of Palestine or on the question of Bosnia-Herzegovina earlier. You look at the way the UN General Assembly voted. Look at the way the UN General Assembly has voted every year on the question of Cuba. It goes against the way the US thinks. And the US thinks together with 2 or 3 other friends, Israel, the Solomon Islands, and you know, 1 or 2 other groups of that sort. The vast majority of nation states think differently. So the point I'm making is, you know, the sort of ideal that you and I are interested in, you know, nation states, individual freedom, sovereignty, and so on. You see some of it in the UN General Assembly. And it is not in line with what the US wants. But the General Assembly does not prevail because security, according to the UN Charter, is in the hands of the UN Security Council. And the Security Council is controlled by the powerful states. This, I think,
we see things happening at 2 different levels then, one which is inefficient and the other one which has the say at the end of the day. Dr. Chandra, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time here, and we always appreciate your wisdom, and we appreciate your you know, contribution for a just society so far. And I think we can close at this point, and we can have you again, you know, in our future conversations, and hopefully we don't have to discuss this kind of matters. Hopefully things will get moving into, you know, more less actually it's what is happening right now. It's really very, very disturbing for everyone. So
it is.
we just hope that it's not going to get worse.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a note in which we can conclude, and I hope that you'll be able to attend our webinar also and other webinars that we will be holding, you know, in future. Not just our group, many other groups which are concerned about issues like this. And we are on the same page when it comes to the larger question of the sort of world we want to see evolving, you know, a just world, a world where, you know, principles of living and values of human existence, like justice and compassion, dominate, you know, rather than power and, you know, position, wealth, which is what's happening at the moment. Now, this is a long order. It's a struggle that will take many, many decades. But I think we should be consistent. We should be consistent, look at the situations as they are. And it's very difficult, you know, to be truly balanced in situations like this, because all of us have our positions, but we should try to be balanced.
We should try. It should, yeah. It shouldn't be taken for granted, I think.
Yeah, that's right. I agree. You know, and this is what is is one of the challenges. But nonetheless, I hope more and more people speak up and write, network, link up with others. There is some hope. There is some hope.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chandra.
Thank you very much.
We appreciate.
Thank
See you
for
soon.
initiating this. Thank you. Thanks. Take care and yes.